with Mark. It's not in chronological order, but he's arranged it in a way that he's trying to make a point. And the point that he's trying to make is that Jesus is the Messiah, and that means we need to deny self and follow Him, which we'll get into particularly when we get into chapter 8 in a couple of weeks, when we get to that big question that Jesus is going to ask the disciples, and Peter's going to give an answer, and that's going to change the shift. So the first half of the book of Mark is about proving that Jesus is the Messiah, that He is God the Son. And then the second half of the book is going to help us to understand what that means, that the Messiah is not a king that's going to reign on a throne on earth, but rather that He is a suffering servant. And so what we have, as we've been talking about it in the first half, is so many miracles. And we're down to because we're getting into the end of chapter 7, beginning of chapter 8, we're getting into the very last of this big flurry of miracles, down to the last 4 before that turning point in the book. But you have these miracle sections, and then after Jesus performs miracles, that causes the crowds to gather, which brings about the opposition from the Pharisees and the scribes and the religious leaders. And then Jesus will have a teaching section where He's trying to explain what's going on and to counteract the false ideas. And that's what, as we're getting into another miracle section with 3 miracles back to back to back, don't forget where this is placed and why it's placed here. We've just got through talking before last week. We spent a couple weeks talking about this, what happened in the first 23 verses of chapter 7, how that the Pharisees came out and they're challenging Jesus because your disciples don't do the ceremonial washings of the hands before you eat, and why don't y'all follow the traditions of the fathers and the elders and those types of things. And Jesus just tells them, that's not really what's important. You're making up these laws, and you're putting that equal to or even above what God's law is. And so He teaches about what we talked about 2 weeks ago, what really defiles. Verses 14 through 23. What really defiles is not what goes into the man, but what comes out of the man, because it shows where his heart is, which links us back to chapter 6 and the parable of the sower and the seeds. And what kind of heart do you have? Which is really, again, really important throughout this Gospel of Mark. So understand what he's just talked about in chapter 7, verses 14 through 23, this idea of that what comes out of the mouth shows what kind of heart you have. And that's why we're going to see the 3 different miracles that we're going to see linked together. So those miracles start in chapter 7, verse 24, and they go through chapter 8 and verse 10. And we may get through all 3 of them tonight, or maybe just the first 2. I really think we'll probably just do the first 2. So the first one is in verses 24 through 30, healing the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. And as you get into the text in verse 24, it says, and from there, and where he was at that time he was at Capernaum when all these other things had happened, his hometown. So Jesus gets up from his hometown and he travels. And where he travels to is Tyre, some people pronounce it, and Sidon. And he goes there, which is over to the west. It's in Gentile country. I'll show you here on a map. I actually took the time instead of just drawing a map this time. But you can see up in the center of the screen up there on the left, that's right next to the Mediterranean Sea. The Phoenician people were sailors, and so it would make sense that they were there. The Syrophoenicians were called so to distinguish themselves between those Phoenicians in that area and the Phoenicians that were down in northern Egypt. But you see the 2 cities there that you've got north of Galilee, north of Jewish country, up into Gentile country. You've got these 2 very prominent seaside cities. But again, Jesus is going to Gentile territory. We've talked about over and over again how much Mark has emphasized the fact of these crowds that keep growing. The more that Jesus is out there, the more people are following him. And he has to go to Gentile country in order to get away from the crowds, to take a little bit of a break. And that's really what he's doing when he comes to Tyre and Sidon is that you notice in the second half of verse 24, he gets there, but it says that when he got there, he entered a house, and he didn't want anybody to know because he's trying to take a break. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. That we all have times when we need to rest, we need to refresh, and we need to recharge. And even Jesus, who is 100% God, is still 100% man, and he needed those times. So he goes to Gentile territory so that he can rest. He goes there not really planning on ministering to anybody or doing anything, but just taking some time, and we'll see that as we continue on in the text, taking the time to just relax, to rest, to recharge. But even here in Gentile country, Jesus couldn't rest because of the crowds. There were all of these people that were looking for him. And his fame had spread so far. This is about where he's at now. It's about 50 miles or so from Jerusalem, which is about as far away as he's going to get in his time on earth that we know of during his ministry. And he's going to the outer limits to try to get away from everybody. But even there, everybody's heard about Jesus, and everybody's heard what he's been teaching, and everybody's heard what he's been doing, especially, which is relevant to what we're going to talk about with these miracles. And so they're coming to find Jesus because of their desire to see him. But it says immediately, once he gets there, he hadn't been there any time at all, when this woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit. Now, sometimes you'll have people question about what's the difference in an unclean spirit and a demon. If you'll go on down a couple of verses, you'll see that she asked Jesus to cast out the demon that's in her daughter. It's the same thing, so don't think that they're used synonymously. But her little daughter has an unclean spirit. And that's, if you've ever had a sick child, you know you'd rather have something wrong with you than your children, especially a little daughter, a little child. She has these unclean spirit, and the mother had heard about Jesus. Well, among the things that we've seen Jesus do, just in the Gospel of Mark, we've seen him heal all sorts of physical diseases, but we've also seen him cast out demons, remember? And so she had heard about that. No telling what kind of ends she had gone to try to find help for her little daughter, but now she finds a guy who she's heard of can do. But she doesn't just hear it, she ultimately believes in it because it causes her to do something about it. It says that she came. So she heard, she believed, and then she goes to where Jesus was. And when she came into where he was, she fell down at his feet. Now you think about, we talked about with the woman that had the bleeding issue and the different barriers that was between her and approaching Jesus that she had to have the faith to go through. In John 4, I've got written up there because in John 4 it's even more barriers similar to this woman. Not only was there the barrier between someone who was a woman and a man, and that wasn't an interaction that happened in a public discourse like that, between a rabbi or a teacher, which was what Jesus was considered, and someone, a woman especially, coming up to him. But she was a Gentile, just like the woman at the well was a Samaritan, not a Jew. And so there's that barrier. Then there's the barrier of the fact that because her daughter has this unclean spirit, she would have been considered unclean not only because she was a Gentile, but also because of the fact that her daughter was unclean, and she had obviously, most likely, I guess we could say, had been in contact with her. But none of those barriers, you think about if your child was really, really sick, what kind of barriers you would go through, what you would go, you'd be willing to do in order to help your child. And we see that with this woman as well, that she's willing to go through all those barriers. The reason that she is, though, is because she believes that Jesus can do something about it. And so in verse 26 it says, now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth. And it's interesting that Mark really pays attention to that he really focuses on the fact that she is a Gentile. of all the things that he could have focused on. There's a reason for that, I think, and especially in the conversation that they're going to have. But as we even continue on into the next miracle that we're going to talk about, Mark's wanting you to understand this isn't just anybody. This is a Gentile woman that's come to Jesus with this matter of her daughter. And it says that, and the ESV is what I've got up here, is she begged. Some of your translations may say something like she kept asking, and that's really a little bit better here because that's the construction of that verb. Not that she just asked or she just begged, but that she kept on asking and begging. It was one of those kind of like whenever you're driving with your 6-year-old and he goes, "Daddy, how much further? Daddy, how much further? Daddy, how much further?" Or whenever I was 15 and how many times I would go to my parents and say, "You really ought to buy me a brand new truck because, I'm the good son, So anyway, I didn't get it, bad parenting. But anyway, we'll talk about that some other time. But this is really the idea. She kept begging. She kept asking. She kept on. She was persistent in what she was doing. And it really reminds you of, the widow that kept going to the judge and just wore him out. And that's what she's doing here with Jesus. I've got another map here to show you the Syrophoenician area up here to the north of where Sidon and Tyre were, back towards the right, towards the east up there is where she would have traveled from to come to Jesus. That was the area that she would have at least been born in if she still lived in her homeland, and we would have to assume that she did. So she kept begging. She was persistent, asking Jesus over and over and over, will you take care of this for me? In verse 27, it says that Jesus said to her, "Let the children be fed first." Let the children be fed first. Jesus is going to make the illustration for her, or make the point, I guess is a better way of saying it, make the point to her that I was sent to come to the Jews first and not to the Gentiles. And as you read this sounds kind of weird, a thing kind of strange for Jesus to say. If you read commentaries, they're all over the map about what they think it means because the text doesn't really tell us. But there's even some that'll say this is Jesus being rude to the woman. This is Jesus acting like all the other Jews would have acted toward a Gentile woman, those kinds of things. We can, I think, throw those out the window to start off with. But you've got Jesus trying to tell her that, I'm here to bring the news of the kingdom of God to the Jews. And that's why it was always foretold that it would come to the Jews first and then the Gentiles. But at the same time, you look at Jesus' life, and Jesus has ministered to Gentiles before this. I mean, when he went across the Sea of Galilee over to where as soon as he gets off the boat, the man that is possessed by legion, he's in Gentile country. And he doesn't, when legion runs up and says, "What have you to do with us, Jesus?" He didn't say, "Whoa, I'm not here to do anything with you. You just go do your business and I'll keep to myself." He didn't do that. So it's interesting at the least to see why Jesus is saying this. But I think when you look at the context, what we're going to talk about, it's helpful to keep that big picture idea in mind. If you think about the children be fed first, what Jesus is going to describe here is a family kind of situation. And there's lots of references that we're going to see back to when Jesus fed the 5,000. Just a spoiler alert, the third of these three is the feeding of the 4,000. But you've also got this idea of the children being the Jews. That's who he's going to first. And then the word here, the children must be fed first, Well, that's the word that doesn't just mean fed, it means satisfied, to be full, which is the word back in the feeding of the 5,000. Once they ate and they ate until they were satisfied or full. See, they didn't just get a snack, they got the full all-you-can-eat buffet. So the children must be fed. That allusion back to chapter 6 and verse 42, and, spoiler alert, chapter 8 and verse 8, when he feeds the 4,000. It's going to be the same thing. They're going to be full or satisfied. So he says, let the children be fed first. It's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. We're not going to take, again, you think about this family environment. If you've got a certain amount of food and you've got pets and you've got children, you're not going to say, well, boys, I know y'all are hungry, but the dog comes first. You know, that's not the way it works, is it? You love your children because they're part of the family. And so that's the illustration that Jesus is making here. Again, people a lot of times will make this big deal about Jesus using this idea, throwing it to the dogs. Clearly, in the illustration that he's using, the Gentiles would be the dogs. And so a lot of people say, well, Jesus is using a derogatory term. He's running down the Gentiles. Does that sound like Jesus running down people or using derogatory terms? Well, of course not. It's an illustration is all that he's doing here, to show that the pecking order is I'm bringing the news about the kingdom to the Jews first and then the Gentiles. And I think you can further boost the idea that it's not a derogatory term that he's using here in the way he's doing it. Now, was dogs used as a derogatory term? Yes, sometimes it was. But you and I both know that a lot of it depends on how something is said, body language and all that. And clearly, the way Jesus said it and the body language he used must have not been offensive to this woman. Because notice in verse 28 what her reaction is. She answered him, "Yes, Lord." So the first thing she says is, yes, you're right. We're not the part of the family. We're not part of the children. We are the house pets, and that's the word. The dogs there is a small dog, like a house pet. It's not the wild dogs that run around as cleaning up the streets and that kind of thing. That's not what we are. We're not one of your children. We are outside the family right now. So the fact that she agrees with him, I think, shows that it's not a derogatory statement that Jesus is making. But then notice the second thing she says to him. She says yes, and then she says, Lord, or Master, some translations say. So she's showing respect and reverence to him still. She's not upset by the answer that he gave. But notice the wisdom that she replies to him with. She says, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. In other words, I get you're feeding the children. I get that you're here for the Jews. But can't we benefit a little bit? Can't we get the scraps? If you've got inside dogs, we've never had inside dogs, but you eat at somebody's house that has inside dogs, and they're always right when you sit down at the supper table, where they at? They're right there waiting on something to fall, right? They love it when Gannon comes over because he gets more on the floor than he does in his mouth, I think, sometimes. But that's what she's saying. Can't we be there at the table and benefiting something? But she accepts his authority. But notice the idea that's here, right here. She answered him. Remember what Jesus said back in chapter 7 earlier? When he's talking about what comes out of the mouth shows what? What kind of heart you have. So what kind of heart does she have? She shows one that's submissive to Jesus. She shows one that recognizes his authority. She shows one that has great faith in him. She shows one that recognizes that everything about him is a benefit. She shows one that has some wisdom in the way that she approaches it. If you, again, keep in context, Jesus has got through at the beginning of this chapter saying, what what comes out of the mouth shows whether you've got a defiled inside or a pure inside. What kind of heart do you have? Well, her heart, by her answer, shows that she has a good heart. And notice how Jesus backs that up in verse 29. He said to her, for this statement, what she said in verse 28, for this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. Notice Jesus had said before to different ones, your faith has made you whole, or because your faith you've been cleansed. Jesus this time says it's because your answer made you whole. Why is that? Because your answer, what came out of your mouth, showed what kind of heart that you had, that you didn't have a defiled heart. Does that make sense? You see how all that connects together? And so she goes on her way, and that's what happens. And then notice in verse 30, she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Now, how far away was it that she lived? We don't know for sure. But the point to be made here is that Jesus has cast out demons before, but where was he every time he cast out the demons? He's right there with the person, right? However far she was, if she lived down the street, the next house over, 10 miles down the road, 50 miles down the road, did it matter with Jesus? He can heal from a distance. Which, keep that in mind when we get to the next miracle, because Jesus heals in a variety of ways. There's not a way that Jesus healed. And sometimes you're sitting there going, what did he do that for? Why would you spit on the ground and make some mud and say, here's mud in your eye to a blind man? Well, I don't know, but nonetheless, Jesus has that power over distance there. So the first miracle, we see this woman's heart is not defiled because of her answer, and we see Jesus' power, again, showing that he's God the Son. Yes, sir. That's right. And of course, he wasn't even trying to do that. He wanted to take a break. And she's interrupting his vacation to say, hey, I need you to help me with something. But, you know, it shows his power and his authority that, and maybe it was because I want to get back to taking a break, you know. But that even isn't going to happen. The next of the three miracles, the healing of the deaf and mute man, verses 31 through 37. And verse 31 says, then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. So if you look at the map, again, you got Sidon and Tyre up there at the kind of the top of the center. It doesn't, I've got the arrow drawn so that you could see maybe the cities here. This is the route, this left arrow is the route he took. He went down to the Sea of Galilee and then across. But I've got that top arrow up there just so that you don't miss it with all the cities around the Sea of Galilee. But Jesus can't find any rest there. He can't hide out there. So he goes from there all the way down to the bottom right-hand corner to the Decapolis, which is, again, Gentile country. And, by the way, this is a place where Jesus had been before. This is Legion country. Okay, this is where he went when he cast out legion. So he returned from there and he went to the Decapolis. And if you remember, whenever Jesus healed the man, remember they couldn't bind him with chains or anything, and Jesus cast them into the swine and they run off. We talked about it was the first example of deviled ham ever. You know, he cast them into the pigs and they ran down in the water, and all the people that was there wanted Jesus to leave. But you remember what the man who was possessed with legion wanted to do? You remember? He wanted to go with him. But Jesus said, don't go with me, stay here. And what did he tell him not to do? Don't tell anybody. But what did the man do? He went and told everybody. He couldn't help it, you know. So he's told everybody in this region. Jesus is going to another Gentile area that everybody there knows all about him. And so in verse 32, they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. Hello. Anyway, He was deaf and had a speech impediment. Now, why would they bring this man who was deaf and had a speech impediment to him? Undoubtedly, they've heard what he can do, and very likely heard it from the guy or the people that he told, and then they spread it on around. So as soon as Jesus arrives, again, we're in Gentile country. They bring this man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. Now, maybe they had heard about some time that Jesus had healed others and he'd laid his hand on them, and that's why they asked for that specifically. I don't know, but that's what's going on. And then, verse 33, taking him aside privately, which, again, you read the commentaries, they're going to tell you all different reasons, and it's speculation is all it is. Why did Jesus take him away privately? I don't know. The text doesn't tell us. But you can imagine how someone that was in, this is a time before you had, sign language or anything like that. Most people that were deaf and mute or speech impediments, you know how those two are connected so closely together, oftentimes were considered to be ignorant, to be socially outcast and stuff like that. So maybe Jesus does it to show how much he cares about the guy. He's not wanting to draw any more attention to him. I don't know, but that's what he does, is he takes him away privately. And then another one of those what's going on here kind of moments. He put his fingers into his ears. So Johnny shrunk up like it. I'm not going to put them in your ears because I don't know when you had a bath last. But last Sunday, what? Yeah. He put them in his ears. Now, why did he do that? I don't know. There's some that speculate, and I think maybe this makes sense at least. I don't know that's why he does it. But if you're someone who is deaf and has a speech impediment, I can't tell you I'm going to heal you. I don't want it to be a shock to you. Have you seen the videos of like small children that are deaf and they get the implants to where they can hear, and the first time that they hear something, the reaction, the shock. If you're born that way, you don't know that's what this is for, And then all of a sudden your brain is flooded with all this new stimuli that, where's that coming from? So maybe that seems to makes sense. The next one, maybe not so much. After spitting, he touched his tongue. So he didn't just spit on the ground. It's like he spit on his finger. Aren't you glad you wore a mask tonight? He spit and he touched his tongue. Now why? I have no idea. Did Jesus have to put his fingers in his ears to heal him? Did he have to lay his hand on him to heal him? Did he have to spit on his hand and the deaf man right now is saying, no, he didn't have to do that, But he did. Why? I don't know. Sometimes Jesus laid his hands on people. Sometimes he told them to go do something. Sometimes he, from a far distance, said, here it is. He did it in a variety of ways, and I'm not sure the why and the how, but anyway, that's what he did. Here's the important point. Maybe Mark doesn't explain that because that's not the point of the passage. The point of the passage is what happens next. In verse 34, it says that Jesus, looking up to heaven, he sighed. And again, that's probably not the best translation for this word. Sigh, we think of a sigh being a right? This is a word for groaning, for hurting. This is a word that, imagine if you got really bad news about someone, you might look up and cry out to heaven. That's what Jesus does. And, it's the same word, by the way, that is told to us that, whenever we don't know exactly how to express ourselves to God, the Holy Spirit does with groanings. This is that word. Maybe this is Jesus just crying out because he feels the pain of this man and what he's had to go through in his life. And so He uses an Aramaic word that just says, be opened. And when that happened, his ears were opened. I think it's funny because in 34 it says that he said to him, and the him is the man who's deaf, but he says to him, be opened. He couldn't hear that, but then his ears were opened. And his tongue was released. He was cured immediately, and he spoke plainly. He immediately had command over the language. It wasn't now that you can hear, we'll get you set up with some rehab, and we'll have some language teachers come over and kind of work you through the process. He immediately began talking. Even if someone has some kind of surgery to correct their hearing, if they've had hearing loss, there's a process that they have to go through to learn to talk. But that's not what happened here, because this is a miracle. And so immediately his ears are opened, and immediately he spoke plainly. Immediately the two things that were wrong with him were no longer wrong with him. And so Jesus charged them to tell no one. This is that messianic secret that we've talked about, that you keep seeing through the book of Mark, where Jesus is saying, don't tell anybody. And again, he didn't tell us why, that he didn't want them telling anybody, but he tells them don't tell anybody. But he tells them don't tell anybody, but the more he charged them, I don't know if there's ever a good time or reason to disobey the Lord, but maybe this is it. The more he told them, don't you tell, the more, it's kind of like when Melody is sitting down next to me and she'll start scratching my back, and I say, boy, you better quit that, you know. The more he told them, don't you tell, the more they told. In fact, the more zealously they proclaimed it. The word for preached. They preached it. Kind of like with Legion. Don't tell, and he goes and tells everybody. Now, verse 36 is a hard verse for me to look at, because you've got Jesus telling people, commanding people repeatedly, don't tell. And they said, we can't help it. We got to tell. And at the same time, Jesus is telling me, Corey, you go tell. And I don't go tell everybody. If we get who Jesus is and what an impact that he's made on our lives, and you think about the ability to hear and the ability to speak, that would be a huge impact. But that's going to last. If the man is 20 years old, at best, what's it going to last him? 50 years? 70 years? What Jesus did for me impacted eternity. And am I willing to tell everybody, no matter what? And so, verse 37 says that they were astonished. We keep seeing these words in Mark, like astonished or amazed or dumbfounded or whatever, over and over again. And the reason why is because Jesus is doing something that I've never seen anybody else do before. Beyond measure, they were astonished, saying, remember what we said back in chapter 7 earlier? Out of the mouth shows what kind of heart that you have. So this is what they're saying. He has done all things well. He's made the deaf hear and the mute speak, which, by the way, the prophet Isaiah had said he was going to do when he got there. But notice what they're saying. He does everything he does well. Everything he does is perfect, is wonderful, is marvelous. Everything he does is amazing. What kind of heart did they have? See, the scribes and the Pharisees, did they see the miracles Jesus performed? Did they? And what did that make them want to do? Oh, we got to ruin his reputation. We got to shut him down and shut him up. Because they had defiled hearts. But their hearts are, look at who he is and what he's done. And their hearts were pure, and that's why they said, I got to go tell everybody about this. Yes, sir.
All right, so we can back up to the deaf man and assume that possibly why he touched him was to see if he was willing to submit
Maybe. Yeah, maybe so. But if I'd have been the deaf man, I'd say, what are you doing? It's an interesting thing. And I don't know, again, it may be to indicate this is what I'm fixing to do to you, or it may be, like you say, to try to see if he's willing to let him or whatever. But the point is that he did it. And the hearts of all these people that are there are Gentile people. And notice what kind of hearts that they have. So again, you go back and you look in the greater context, what's going on here. What's going on is it's all connected back to what kind of heart do you have, which connects you back to what kind of soul do you have in your heart. And so then we have the third of the miracles, and we'll run through it quickly because there's a lot that's repeat. Yes, ma'am. Right. Yeah. And that happened to a certain extent anyway, even without all of this, you know. Yeah, he would have needed Secret Service, yeah, for sure. And that's what Peter thought he was. That's why he was always asking about swords and drawing his sword and all that. And Jesus is like, do you really think I need you to, after everything you've seen me do, you really think I need you to protect me? But was there anybody else that had something to say? Y'all all heard her, but I didn't. Okay. So, feeding the 4,000 is in chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. And we're still in this same region. In those days is in the days in which he's been down here in the Decapolis and he's healed this man. And of course, everybody's telling everybody. They're saying that everything he does well. And Jesus keeps saying, don't tell them. And they keep telling them. And the more they're telling, the bigger the crowd is growing. Jesus didn't start off when he first arrived on the shore with 4,000 people there, but now that's what we're up to. So in those days, when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and he said to them, I have compassion on the crowd. That's what he said back in chapter 6 and verse 34. But remember, in chapter 6, he's dealing with Jewish people. Now in chapter 8 rather, he's dealing with Gentile people in Gentile country. So I felt compassion on the crowd. I feel what they're going through, and I want to help them because they've been with me now 3 days. They're committed, right? You know, whenever Jared or I preaches a few minutes over, well, you know what time we're supposed to get out of here, you know, but Jared gets up and says, I have a 3-day sermon I'd like for you to listen to. Then what's that over there? You know, you're going to be trying to sneak out, right? But they're committed. They want to hear what he has to say. They want to follow him. They've had nothing to eat all this time. And Jesus says, if I send them away hungry to their homes, they'll faint on the way because some of them have come from far away. They've been coming from everywhere to see him. And so his disciples answered, remember back in chapter 7, how you answer, what comes out of your mouth shows what kind of heart you have. So what kind of heart does the disciples have? How can anybody feed these people with this little bread in this desolate area? Now, if there's anybody on the scene that should have known, hey, I know what we can do, who should it have been? Those 12 guys should have said, hey, this sounds familiar. I think I've been in, have you ever done that before where you do something or you go somewhere and you're like, I feel like I've been here before. Well, the disciples should have been saying, hey, we one time went through this, and we didn't know exactly what Jesus was going to do or how we could feed everybody, but now we know where to go. Deja vu. And I've got it written on here eventually, but it's kind of like, I can't name his name now. Played catcher and was a manager for the Yankees. Deja vu all over again. He said, this is real, not just deja vu, but deja vu all over again. Yogi Berra, that's what I was trying to think. So Jesus asked them, well, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7, which was more loaves of bread than they had last time. They had 5 loaves last time, right? They got less people and more bread, and they fed everybody and had 12 baskets of leftovers last time. And they're saying, I don't have a clue what we're going to do. I don't know how we're going to feed all these people. It never strikes them that maybe Jesus was the answer. And so he directs the crowd to sit down on the ground, just like he did in chapter 6. And he took the 7 loaves, just like he did in chapter 6. And having given thanks, not just for the 7 loaves, but for all God's going to provide, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, just like he did in chapter 6, to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd, just like they did in chapter 6. You remember in chapter 6 we were talking about how that the way it's constructed, it's like they kept coming and getting bread and fish and kept giving it to the people, and they'd pass it out, and they'd come back, and Jesus just got that little sack lunch from that boy, and they'd fill up their basket, and then they'd go pass it out, and I know he didn't have any more, but he just filled up my basket again. And they did that till they fed 5,000 people completely full. And the disciples start doing the exact same thing that they did. I don't know if their memory wasn't that good or what it was, but it never struck them, hey, this is like deja vu all over again, right? And it said they had a few small fish. Now here in chapter 8, the emphasis is on the bread, and I don't know why, unless you're maybe drawing the line back up to when he's dealing with the Syrophoenician woman, and he says, I've got to feed the children first, the bread, and she asked for the crumbs. So they had a few small fish, and having blessed it, he's not saying, and did anything to it. The word here just means I'm giving thanks for it. When we bless the food, we're not asking God to turn this piece of pizza into a piece of cauliflower after it gets past my taste buds. We're supposed to just give thanks for it. So having given thanks for it, having blessed it, he said that these also should be set before them, these fish. And they ate, and they ate, and they ate, and they were satisfied. But the word is the word for filled. You know, if I eat till I'm satisfied, you know, that's when I just ordered the 3-piece fish dinner. When I order the all-you-can-eat fish dinner is when I get full, right? They didn't get the 3-piece dinner. They got the all-you-can-eat dinner. They ate until they were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full, which numbers mean something to the Hebrew people. 7 would be perfect, the perfect amount of food. And there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And as far as we know, there was never a time where Andrew went to John and said, you know, this seems familiar. But that's what happened. So verse 10, immediately he got in the boat with his disciples, and they went to the district of Dalmanatha, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple of weeks. But you've got this this Gentile woman rather, who answers, and out of her mouth shows the purity of her heart, that you are Lord, and I'll take whatever I can get from you. You've got the people that saw the miracle that out of their mouth show the purity of their heart, and they're saying everything he does is good, and I got to tell everybody about him. And then you've got the disciples that out of their mouth says, I don't know what we're going to do. But isn't that what we do? Whenever we have a big decision to make, or there's a financial crisis, or there's a medical emergency, or there's tornadoes in the area, or whatever it is, and we say, what can we do? What am I going to do about this? How are we going to get through this? But we don't think about talking to the Lord, do we? Not near enough. So, what are we showing? What kind of hearts are we showing with what's coming out of our mouth? That's the question for us to ask. And that's especially important considering what, well, there's another fly. What it is that's going on, missed it, with the disciples and the conversation he's going to have with them on in chapter 8. So next week we're going to have a devotional period in here as it's just a few days before Christmas, and a lot of people will be out of town, and then we'll get back into chapter 8 in a few weeks then. Let me give you a few announcements that we need to make you aware.